the orthoPAC, hosted by Sam Dyer. Welcome to the orthoPAC, where we discuss up-to-date orthopedic topics for the busy clinician. I invite you to sit back and relax as I attempt to fill in the gaps between education, current events, and real-world practice.
Hello listeners, welcome back to the orthoPAC. Today's topic is a little off the beaten path. Well, actually it's a lot off the beaten path, but it's something I want to talk about, and it is my podcast, so there you have it. This one's not really about orthopedics at all. It's about life in general and what happens when someone close to you dies. Very few of you know this, but I'm dealing with the recent loss of my mother. She had a very long, protracted battle with dementia and passed peacefully at home not too long ago. I'm still in the grieving process, but if you have ever had any experience with someone you love who's affected by dementia or Alzheimer's, you know that I've been grieving her for a few years now as her condition's gotten worse. Grief to me is a long process, and what I'm really coming to realize is there isn't an end point. When people become a memory, they are with you forever. But discussing grief is not why I'm doing the podcast. I'm doing this podcast to tell you about my experience with what comes after someone close to you dies. My mother used to like to quote Hank Williams Sr., "No one gets out of this world alive." I don't think most people realize how much there is to do when you lose someone. I didn't, and I know this is especially true when there is property and inheritance involved. So the following are some things I want to share with you from my own experience, and I hope it's useful information for you. If you are in a position like I am, you're not only a beneficiary, but also the executor of the estate, and that carries a lot of responsibility. So to start with, I should backpedal some and tell you that you really need to have a sit-down discussion with your family member while they are still in somewhat good health and mentally competent. You need to go over things such as their will, their last wishes, and what they want done with their estate. No one likes to have these conversations. I know I didn't want to have this conversation, but we did, and at this point I'm glad I did it when we did. It's really best to have these kinds of discussions with an estate planning attorney. So my mother and I visited an acquaintance of mine who's an attorney, and he prepared several documents, and I would recommend you consider all of these if you're going to be the beneficiary or primary caregiver. He prepared a power of attorney, a healthcare power of attorney, a last will and testament, and a warranty deed to her property. This allowed the title of the property to be transferred in my name, and I registered at the courthouse. I also transferred the title of her vehicle and paid insurance on the vehicle and her property on my own policies. I also had my name put on her bank accounts. It took a lot of work, and it was, costly. It's not cheap to have all that stuff done, and several $100s, but it was done. But let me tell you what the alternative is. I have some cousins who also lost their mom a few years ago, my mother's sister, and they did not have any of this legal work done ahead of time, and now they're going through probate. So the estate still isn't settled, and it's a few years into it. I mean, this is just a nightmare scenario. If nothing else from this podcast, please get these documents that I mentioned earlier done ahead of time. You don't want to be thinking about this stuff while you're trying to grieve your loss. It's just the wrong time for that. So the first and most immediate concern when someone dies is coordinating their funeral. Ideally, you might have this set up ahead of time, but like with the situation with my mother, this is not something she would talk about. So basically, I had to figure this one out on my own. Making these decisions that come up with this, especially when you're in the acute phase after a loss and you're really grieving, is not the easiest task in the world. If you have the ability to do it, try to do it ahead of time. But my advice is to make sure everyone knows what the person wanted. There are several things you got to think about. Is it going to be a casket funeral? And if it's a casket, is it going to be open or closed? Will there be a cremation? Is there going to be a funeral service? And if there is, will it be at the church or will it be at the funeral home chapel? Will you do obituaries in the newspaper? And if you do a newspaper obituary, make sure you get someone to get several copies of the paper when it's published, because you don't want to have to go back and get reprints. You will most likely need some help writing up the service. You need to gather up pictures, any kind of readings that you would like, music, and all of that kind of thing that you want to include in your relatives or your loved one's service. All of this you need to pick out if it's not already arranged. One of the things the funeral home will do for you is get official copies of death certificates. I personally got 10, which is more than I needed, but I would rather have more than less. I don't want to have to wait on a death certificate if I need to close something out. The more accounts you have to address, the more copies you need. And many places will take a photocopy, but some, especially government organizations, require an original with a date stamp. And if you are inclined for this, some people aren't, but if you are, you have to have an officiant to give the service, which is a minister, and that costs. And in my family, everyone comes back to the house after the service for food and fellowship. So make sure you start a spiral notebook or whatever works for you, and make sure you write down all the names and addresses of people you want to send a thank you note to. Very important to have this done. You don't want to be thinking about, oh, so-and-so did this, and, how do I get in contact with them, etc. So when you go to the funeral home and you're preparing this, be ready. It's not cheap, a few $1,000s at minimum. And they also present you with a whole lot of options, almost like an itemized list. So do you really want to spend $150 for a notebook register or $200 for thank you notes that come from the funeral home? How about $500 to $1,000 for a custom urn? And a low-end casket is several $1,000s. All this I'm telling you because you could easily wind up with a bill over $10,000. My advice is don't make these decisions while you're in the acute phase of experiencing the trauma. It's really important, if you can, to make them ahead of time, and then all you have to do is follow through on the plan. And having a level-headed third person to help you make sense of all the choices is crucial. Family, friends, and support, so you don't have to do this by yourself. And then what about the burial? Most people listening to me through this podcast probably don't go to cemeteries that much. To be honest with you, I don't either. I try to stay away if I can. But if you are having to do a burial at a cemetery, do you have a plot? Does your family have a place for you to go? And then when do you do the burial? Do you do it on the same day as the service, or do you have it on a separate day and just have the family attend? If it's cremation, are you spreading the ashes, or are you going to bury them? What are the rules and regulations of spreading ashes somewhere? There's so much to consider, and you haven't even really gotten started yet. There are several other things you need to do. Either you or the funeral home would call the Social Security Administration, assuming your loved one is drawing Social Security. And when you do notify Social Security, they will notify Medicare. The funeral home usually does this. I did it on my own because I wanted to make sure. If your loved one lived through the month they were paid their Social Security check, you get to keep that. But if they died in the middle of the month, Social Security either won't mail you the check once they've been notified, or they will take it back, which means that if you had a direct deposit, you're going to have to return that. Any retirement system or bank account or any of that kind of stuff, you're going to also need to notify. So it's good to have a list of all that ahead of time. Also, if there are any life insurance policies, you're going to need all the information, the demographics, and the official death certificate. So make sure you have plenty of copies for that stuff. And if you have an insurance agent that you have a rapport with, contacting them to help you get through all of this is very helpful. So what about if you're a beneficiary? I hope, like I said earlier, that you have all of the legal forms in place to avoid probate. But if you are the beneficiary and inherit real estate, what are you going to do with it? Think about that for a second. What are you going to do if you inherit property, and let's say not only is it out of town, it's out of state? What if it needs repairs? Do you have the time and inclination to do that work? Are you willing to accept a full cash offer? What about proceeds? How is that divided among the heirs? What if there's a conflict between the heirs? How do you manage that? Another option is if you're the sole beneficiary and you get 100% of the inheritance, do you share that with other family members? Those are all decisions you have to think about and things that come to mind, and it's really something I've been thinking about a lot. all of those decisions really should be made by the person who is bequeathing the property, not the executor of the will. It's not fair to the person who is being the executor of the property and the estate to have to make those decisions. And you absolutely do not want a probate judge telling you what to do. So make sure you get all that stuff done ahead of time so you know what to do. All you have to do is follow the wishes of the deceased. Probably a lot of you don't have to deal with this, but I did, and that is management of the hoard. And I say that with all due respect. I tell you, I love my mother more than I loved anyone, but gosh bless her, she kept everything. Every utility bill from the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, every greeting card, every gift, every appliance, whether it was broken or not, every bauble, figurine, trinket, valuable or not, everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. So when you're going through this stuff, it's not the easiest process for a couple of reasons. One is there's so much, and two, what do you keep and what do you get rid of, and what's valuable and what's not? There's so much to do. And for anybody that remembers what life was like before the internet and photo software and digital media, there are pictures, shoe boxes, and containers full of them. In my experience, there was a whole wall of several shelves of framed family photos, and we had to go through all that stuff. And that's cathartic, but it's also time consuming. So if you have family members that are willing to help you sort through it, that's great. As you're working your way through this, you have to make some decisions such as, what am I keeping and what am I letting go? Paper stuff, pretty much a no-brainer, that goes out. But what about the furniture, any household items, heirlooms, clothes, everything? Are there lock boxes or safes? If you have locked things like that, where are the keys? Should you have an estate tag sale? Should you have a company to run the tag sale who takes 50% commission? Or do you do it yourself? How much room do you have in your own house to store someone else's stuff that is now yours? I've had several people tell me they rented a storage unit to keep someone else's stuff, and I have to ask why. I mean, let it go. Let someone else get use of it. I think, baubles and trinkets are pretty, but do I really need that stuff to remind me of my mother? No, I don't. And I am not letting her down by getting rid of that stuff. All that stuff had meaning to her, but not really to me. Now, only if I could fit in my high school football jersey again, that would be awesome, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a total hermit. There is a tub of stuff that I want to keep, and it all has meaning to me. It's also interesting to discover some things that I had no idea existed, and also things that have value that I thought would not, while others do not have value that I thought would, if that makes sense. And I'll give you an example. My dad had a collection of California raisins. These were promo figurines from an ad promotion in the 1980s. I think it was Hardee's or some fast food or something. Anyway, he's got a ton of them. And I looked them up on eBay, and you would be amazed at what these things sell for. So he would be excited about that, and that is kind of fun. But anyways, we have talked about what kinds of things you think of in the acute phase, the first few weeks or months, but what about the longer term? You have to cancel any paid subscriptions, things like phone, cable, internet, post office box, pest control, lawn care, caregiver payments. Anything that's an automated payment, you need to cancel. I guess mortgages and loans and things. I'm not sure how to handle that. Luckily, I didn't have to deal with that. But those are things you got to think about. The point of all this is close some of these accounts as soon as possible so you don't make unnecessary payments. And in my experience, it's easier to cancel a payment ahead of time than get a refund later. And now we come to my current situation. I was out of state at my mother's house for a month, literally, and still didn't get it all done. In my situation, there isn't a hurry, but my personality is not to prolong this sort of thing. So I did need a break, though. After weeks of sorting and cleaning and preparing and staging and everything, I just needed some time away. So I wanted to come back and get a podcast done and have some normalcy to my life, but I do have to go back, and I will probably be there a few more weeks when I go, clearing out her house and settling the rest of the estate. Luckily for me, I have the time these days to do this kind of stuff, but you got to understand, if you're working, this really puts your life on hold. I mean, it's been, for me, not working as much as I used to, this has been a totally consuming thing of every waking thought in my life. And I really have mixed feelings about being finished with the process. On the one hand, I'll be glad to finish the sale and hand over the keys to the next person and just kind of be done with that part. But when I got home this time, it was the first time in decades that I did not call my mother first thing on landing to let her know I was home safely. That thought hit me in the soul like a soul punch. I don't know how else to describe it. And it's funny how it's those little things that kind of get you. Anyway, I hope this podcast helps someone out there, and I appreciate you listening. I know this is in orthopedics. I'll get back to clinical orthopedics, but I just needed a chance to put this out there because there's so much to go through, and if I can help someone, I hope I'm being of help to you. I do wish you, if you're going through this, peace and love through your time. And you know what? Don't be afraid to reach out for help from family and friends. If you're trying to manage this all alone, it's an overwhelming process. So it is a process that we have to all go through someday on both sides of the coin, sorting through and leaving for somebody else to sort through. Anyway, I thank you all for listening to my story, and I'll be back soon with some orthopedic content. Till then, take care of yourselves and love each other.